The night was mercilessly cold. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways of the city, carrying with it the scent of damp concrete and distant exhaust fumes. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional flickering street lamp and the sound of footsteps that quickly faded into the darkness. Amidst the discarded trash and forgotten corners of the city, a small, scruffy cat crouched beside a pile of old newspapers. Her fur, once white, was now stained with dirt and dust, blending into the shadows as she shivered against the biting cold. She had no name, at least none that she remembered. To the world, she was just another stray. The cat had learned to survive in this cruel world, scavenging for food from overturned bins, dodging angry shopkeepers, and curling up in the warmest places she could find. But tonight, even the cardboard shelter she had found the previous day was gone, blown away by the relentless wind. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but hunger was nothing new. The cold, however, was unforgiving. She stretched her tired limbs and began to move, her paws silent against the wet pavement. Her ears twitched, alert to any sign of danger. The city was not kind to creatures like her. Then, amidst the eerie silence of the alley, a sound broke through. A faint, almost imperceptible noise. A whimper, a soft, desperate cry. The cat's ears perked up, her sharp instincts kicking in. She turned her head, scanning the darkness. The sound came again, a weak, shuddering wail. Not the cry of another cat, not the squeak of a rat. It was something else, something human. Slowly, cautiously, the cat followed the sound. She weaved through the trash, her small frame slipping effortlessly between broken crates and rusted pipes. The cries grew louder, though still weak, as if the voice had already spent its strength. And then she saw it. Nestled between two large dumpsters, almost hidden from sight, was a bundle of cloth. A tiny, fragile bundle, barely moving. The cat crept closer, her whiskers twitching. The scent was unfamiliar, warm, soft, and tinged with something she did not recognize. She sniffed again, stepping carefully. A tiny hand peeked out from the bundle, trembling. The cat blinked. She did not understand much about humans, but she knew one thing for certain. This creature was helpless, and it was freezing. The cat took another step closer, pressing her small body against the bundle. Instinct told her to run, to leave it behind. It wasn't her problem, yet something deeper, something she couldn't explain, kept her rooted to the spot. The cries were getting weaker. The cold was getting stronger. And so, without truly understanding why, the stray cat curled herself around the abandoned baby. The night deepened, wrapping the city in an eerie silence. The stray cat remained curled around the fragile bundle, her thin body pressing against the fabric in a desperate attempt to share what little warmth she had. The baby's breathing was shallow, its tiny fingers barely moving against the cold. The cat's instincts screamed at her to leave, to seek shelter, to find food. But something held her there, something unfamiliar, a strange sense of duty she had never felt before. She had always been alone, surviving only for herself. Yet now, in the heart of this freezing alley, she found herself guarding a creature even more helpless than she was. The soft gust of wind sent a chill through her bones, making her press closer to the baby. Her ears flicked, listening for any sign of danger. The city was full of threats, humans who would kick her away, larger animals that saw her as prey, and a relentless cold that stole the breath from anything too weak to fight it. The baby whimpered again, barely a whisper in the darkness. The cat licked its tiny hand, her rough tongue brushing against the ice-cold skin. She didn't know what else to do. She only knew that warmth was the only thing keeping this fragile creature from vanishing into the night. She shifted slightly, curling her tail around the baby's exposed fingers. Her fur, though dirty and thin, was the only barrier against the merciless chill. She could hear the baby's heartbeat, faint but steady, the rhythm of life, fragile yet persistent. Her sharp eyes darted around the alley. She knew she couldn't stay here forever. If the cold didn't claim them, something else would. But where could she go? She was just a stray, unwanted and unnoticed. No doors would open for her. No hands would reach out to help. But for the first time in her life, it wasn't just about her anymore. The baby needed more than just a cat's warmth. It needed a miracle. And somehow, some way, the cat decided she would find it. The night stretched on, each passing minute stealing more warmth from the world. The stray cat remained curled around the baby, but she knew it wasn't enough. The child's breathing was faint, its tiny body trembling under the weight of the cold. The cat pressed closer, her instincts screaming at her to act. She lifted her head, ears twitching as she scanned the alleyway. The streets were empty, silent except for the occasional rustling of garbage caught in the wind. There were no footsteps, no voices, no signs of the humans who usually roamed these streets. She couldn't stay here. The cat hesitated, her heart pounding. She had spent her whole life avoiding humans, darting into the shadows whenever they approached. But now she needed one. Someone, anyone, who would see this baby and help. She stood up, feeling the icy air slip between her and the child. The baby let out a weak, broken whimper. It was running out of time. The cat let out a low, uncertain meow. Then another. The sound was barely more than a whisper in the vast emptiness of the city. No one would hear her like this. She had to go farther. Stepping away from the baby was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every instinct screamed at her to stay, to keep holding on to what little warmth she could provide. But warmth wasn't enough anymore. With a final glance at the fragile bundle, the cat turned and ran. Her small paws barely made a sound as she darted through the alley, her heart pounding. She had no idea where to go, only that she had to find someone who would care, someone who would stop. She reached the edge of the alley and slipped onto the sidewalk where the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows. Her sharp eyes darted back and forth. The world felt impossibly vast, and she felt impossibly small. Then, a sound. Footsteps, her ears perked up. A human. The cat rushed forward, her thin legs moving as fast as they could. She spotted a figure, a man bundled in a heavy coat, walking with slow, tired steps. He didn't see her. She ran ahead of him, stopping right in his path. She let out a loud, desperate meow. The man barely glanced at her. Just another stray. He stepped to the side to walk around her. The cat's heart raced. No, he had to see. She meowed again, louder this time. When he kept walking, she did something she had never done before. She jumped forward and swiped at his leg, her tiny claws catching on the fabric of his pants. The man stopped, he looked down, startled. His face twisted with irritation as he shook his leg gently, trying to get her off, but the cat didn't run. She stood her ground, her green eyes locked onto his. Then, she turned and bolted back toward the alley, just far enough to stop and look back at him. She meowed again, her tail flicking, her body tensed with urgency. The man frowned, hesitating. The cat turned again, running back into the darkness, hoping, praying that he would follow. The cat ran, her tiny paws barely touching the cold pavement as she slipped back into the alley. Her heart pounded against her fragile ribs, but she didn't stop. She had no words, no way to explain. Only instinct and desperation. Behind her, the man hesitated. He pulled his coat tighter against the bitter wind, glancing down the dark alley. It was late. He was tired, and yet something about the cat's behavior made him pause. she had looked straight at him, not with the hollow gaze of a hungry stray begging for scraps, but with something else: urgency, desperation, a silent plea. The cat stopped at the spot where the baby lay and turned back, her green eyes glowing faintly in the dim alley. She let out another sharp meow, her tail flicking in distress. The man sighed. He didn't have time for this, but something in his chest twisted, a strange unease that wouldn't let him walk away. With reluctant steps, he moved forward. The alley smelled of damp concrete and rotting trash. The wind howled between the buildings, rattling an old metal door. The man took another step, his boots scraping against the pavement, and then he saw a bundle of cloth barely moving. Small, too small. His breath caught. His body stiffened. For a moment, his mind refused to accept what he was looking at: a baby. His hands moved before his thoughts could catch up. He knelt down, reaching for the fragile bundle. His fingers trembled as he pulled the fabric back, revealing a tiny face, pale and cold. The baby's lips were tinged with blue. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. A cold shock ran through him. It's still alive that he didn't know how long he knelt there, staring, his own breath coming in uneven gasps. The city around him disappeared, swallowed by the sound of the wind and the faint, struggling heartbeat beneath his hands. Then, a soft meowed. He looked up. The cat sat beside him, her small, dirty body still pressed close to the baby, as if shielding it. Her green eyes never left his dot. He hit him then. This cat had led him here. His throat tightened. If he hadn't followed, if he had ignored her, he shook his head, pushing the thought away. There was no time. Carefully, he lifted the baby into his arms. The child was so light, too light, like a fragile whisper of life, barely clinging to existence. The cat followed as he stood up, circling his legs anxiously. She let out another soft meow, her tail flicking as if asking, "What now?" The man exhaled sharply, tightening his grip on the baby. There was only one answer. He had to save this child. Without another thought, he turned and ran. The cat, without hesitation, followed. The man ran. The bitter wind clawed at his face, and the freezing night air burned in his lungs. But he didn't stop. His arms tightened around the frail baby, cradling the tiny body against his chest as if his warmth alone could keep the child alive. His boots pounded against the empty sidewalk, each step echoing in the silence of the sleeping city. The cat followed close behind, her small paws moving swiftly, never falling behind. The man's mind raced. Where do I go? What do I do? The hospital. He had to get to the hospital. He turned the corner sharply, nearly slipping on the icy pavement. The city stretched before him, streetlights flickering, neon signs glowing in the distance. His heart pounded as he scanned the road ahead. No taxis, no cars, just miles of cold, empty streets. The baby let out a weak, shuddering whimper. The sound sent a jolt of panic through him. Hold on. Please, just hold on. The cat meowed sharply, her voice cutting through the night like a warning. She wasn't just following him, she was running with him, as if she understood the urgency, as if she too refused to let this baby slip away. Then, headlights. The man's head snapped up. A car, a lone vehicle moving sluggishly down the street. Hope flared in his chest. Without thinking, he bolted toward the road, stepping into the car's path. The tires screeched. The car skidded to a stop, barely missing him. The driver rolled down the window, his face contorted with anger. "Are you crazy?" But the man didn't care. He rushed to the driver's side, breathless, his arms tightening around the baby. "Please help me. It's a baby. She needs a hospital." The driver's eyes flickered to the bundle in his arms. Confusion turned to shock, then hesitation. The cat, panting from the run, jumped onto the hood of the car and let out a loud, desperate meow. For a moment, silence. Then, with a curse, the driver unlocked the door. "Get in." The man didn't waste a second. He slid into the passenger seat, the baby cradled against his chest. The cat leaped off the hood and scrambled inside, curling at his feet. The driver hit the gas. The car sped down the road, cutting through the icy night. The city blurred past them, streetlights flickering like distant stars. The man looked down at the baby, his heart hammering. Her breaths were still faint, her tiny fingers barely twitching. She was running out of time that he clenched his jaw, his grip tightening just a little longer. "Hold on, we're almost there." The car tore through the empty streets, the engine humming against the quiet pulse of the sleeping city. Every second felt agonizingly slow, each red light a cruel obstacle between them and salvation. The man held the baby close, his heart pounding against his ribs. The child was too still, her breaths too shallow. He pressed a trembling hand against her chest, still moving, but barely. The cat sat curled at his feet, her green eyes locked onto the fragile bundle in his arms. She was tense, ears flicking at every small noise, as if she too understood how thin the thread of life was at this moment. The driver, an older man with graying stubble and tired eyes, glanced at them, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Where did you even find her?" "In an alley," the man said, voice raw. "She was alone. Freezing. If I hadn't..." He stopped himself, swallowing hard. The truth was unbearable. If he hadn't followed the cat, the baby wouldn't have survived the night. The driver let out a low curse under his breath. Damn, what kind of person abandons a baby like that? No answer came. The man looked down again. The baby's skin was still too pale, her tiny fingers unmoving. Then, her body twitched, his breath caught. "She moved," he whispered, half in disbelief, half in desperate hope. The cat let out a soft meow, shifting on the floor. The driver glanced at the rearview mirror. "Hold on, we're almost there." The hospital loomed ahead, its bright lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The car screeched to a halt in front of the emergency entrance. The man barely waited for the driver to stop completely before he threw the door open. He bolted inside, clutching the baby tightly to his chest. "Help!" His voice cracked as he ran into the sterile, white-lit hallway. "Someone please, help her!" A nurse at the front desk looked up, eyes widening at the sight of him. Disheveled, breathless, a tiny, freezing child in his arms. In an instant, chaos erupted. Doctors and nurses rushed forward, a stretcher rolling into view. Hands reached for the baby, carefully peeling back the fabric to assess her condition. The man felt the warmth of her tiny body leaving his arms as she was gently but urgently taken from him. The cat trotted in behind him, stopping at the entrance. She watched everything unfold, her tail flicking anxiously. The doctor turned to the man, his expression grave. "What happened? Where did you find her?" "In an alley," he said, his voice hoarse. "She was alone. I don't know how long she was out there." The doctor nodded sharply. "She's severely hypothermic, but she's alive. We'll do everything we can." And then, just like that, they were gone, rushing the baby behind the emergency room doors. The man stood frozen in the hallway, his breath shallow, his hands shaking. The cat sat beside him, silent. For the first time since that freezing night began, the fight to save the child was out of their hands. The emergency room doors swung shut, swallowing the baby into a world of white coats and sterile lights. The man stood frozen in the hospital hallway, his breath uneven, his heart pounding against his ribs. For the first time since this night began, he was powerless. The cat sat beside him, her small body still and silent. Though the warmth of the hospital air had melted the frost from her fur, she didn't move. Her green eyes remained fixed on the closed doors, her tail curling around her paws in quiet anticipation. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt heavy, stretching endlessly between each breath. The man ran a hand over his face, trying to steady himself. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, but one stood out among them all. Would the baby survive? A nurse approached, her expression kind but unreadable. "Sir, do you have any information about the baby? A name? Parents?" He swallowed. I don't know. I found her abandoned in an alley. If it weren't for the cat." His voice trailed off as he glanced down at the little stray. She was still watching the doors, completely still, the nurse's brows furrowed in concern. She was alone. Yes, it's a miracle she was still alive when we found her. The nurse nodded, jotting something down on her clipboard. "The doctors are doing everything they can. She was suffering from severe hypothermia, but she still had a pulse when she arrived. That's a good sign. A good sign." The man exhaled shakily, nodding, though it did little to settle the weight in his chest. He could still see the baby's tiny fingers, so cold, so still. Will she be okay? The nurse hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. "We'll do our best." The words weren't a promise. They never were. She offered a small, sympathetic smile before turning and walking away, leaving the man standing in the too bright hallway with nothing but the silence pressing against his skin. The cat let out a soft sound, barely more than a whisper of a meow. The man looked down at her. She was still staring at the doors, still waiting. And so, without another word, he sat down on the cold hospital bench beside her if she was going to wait. Then so was he. The hospital was too bright, too sterile, too quiet. The man sat on the cold bench, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. His eyes were fixed on the emergency room doors, but they remained tightly shut, holding the baby behind them like a fragile secret. The cat sat beside him, curled into a small ball, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws. She hadn't moved much since they arrived, her green eyes still locked on the doors, as if willing them to open. Minutes passed, then an hour. The night had been frantic, a desperate race against the cold, against time, against death. But now everything was still, too still. The man exhaled, rubbing his face with his hands. He barely noticed the way his fingers trembled. He didn't even know why he was still here, that he wasn't family. He wasn't a doctor. He was just a stranger, some random man who had stumbled upon an abandoned baby in an alley. He could leave now, walk out of the hospital, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But he didn't move. His gaze drifted downward, landing on the cat. This stray, this tiny, scrappy thing that had once only cared for her own survival, had led him to that baby, had refused to leave her side. Even now, she stayed loyal, unwavering, waiting. Something about that settled heavily in his chest. The hospital doors slid open. The man shot to his feet, his pulse spiking. The cat lifted her head, ears twitching that a doctor stepped out, his face calm but unreadable. He held a clipboard, but the only thing the man saw was the answer that lay behind his eyes. "She's stable," the doctor said. The words hit him like a rush of air after drowning. The tension in his body loosened slightly, his shoulders dropping as he released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "She's alive," the doctor nodded. "Yes, she was suffering from severe hypothermia, but we were able to warm her up and get her vitals steady. She's still weak, but she's responding well." Alive. The word echoed in his mind, grounding him. The cat let out a small meow, as if demanding confirmation. The night had been long, full of fear and uncertainty, but as the first light of dawn crept through the hospital windows, it brought with it something fragile yet powerful. hope. The man stood outside the nursery, looking through the glass at the tiny baby swaddled in soft blankets. Her skin was no longer deathly pale, her breaths no longer shallow gasps. She was still weak, still fighting, but she was here. She was alive. Beside him, the cat sat quietly, her tail flicking against the polished floor. She, too, watched the baby, as if making sure the child she had protected through the freezing night was truly safe now that a nurse approached. "She'll need care, but she's a fighter," she said softly. "The authorities will try to find her family. If no one comes forward, she'll be placed in the system." The system that a hollow feeling settled in a man's chest. He knew how that world worked. How many children were lost in it, forgotten, waiting for someone to want them. His gaze drifted back to the baby, so small, so helpless. And then to the cat, the little stray who had risked everything for a child that wasn't even her own. She hadn't walked away. She had stayed, fought, and saved a life. The man exhaled slowly. Maybe, just maybe, it was his turn to do the same. His hand instinctively reached down, brushing over the cat's head. She purred softly, leaning into his touch that a decision settled in his heart. Quiet but certain he had found the baby in an alley. Alone, unwanted. But maybe that wasn't how her story had to end. Maybe, just maybe, it was only the beginning.